Hello there, my name is Lester Levitt. I'm your professor this semester for the Research Methods class at Florida Atlantic University. The number of the class, PAD4704. This is the first module of the textbook. There is one module per chapter, so there's 14 modules, 14 chapters. The textbook was written by psychology professors. Research methods is, in the social sciences, is very universally applicable. And so the idea that psychology professors could write a research methods textbook that is very well suited for public administration is not it's not a stretch of the imagination at all. So the textbook is Research Methods, Statistics, and Applications by Catherine Adams and Ava K. Lawrence. And so let's get right into it. I chose this textbook. This is the first semester we're using this textbook in the class here at Florida Atlantic University. And I chose this textbook because it has a lot of resources available both in the textbook and online. I haven't dug in deeply into the student study site, but what I had available for me as the instructor was very, very attractive, and I can only assume that what is available off this website here for the students is also equally well suited. If you see from the URL up here, it is at sagepub.com/adams/main, and you should be able to find this link here to see what's available, and we'll work into that as we get through into this. Do not skip the preface in your reading. The preface kind of sets the tone for where we're going to go with this, and so it's going to be important to read the preface. So where she starts the textbook, as you read the textbook and as you think about it, I would like you actually to do the experiment. Imagine yourself, well, instead of under looking the blue sky, imagine yourself under the big banyan tree outside of the social sciences building. I love the tree. That's why it's the backdrop for my green screen here. And so if you're sitting under the big banyan tree and everything's quiet, and just allow your mind to wander. And I want you to think about what concerns you have. Just let your mind go and ponder the circumstances of the world, I guess. And in the experience of the authors, the ladies who have taught this class forever, typically find that students who are enrolled at the university level in social sciences are interested in culture and politics and education and values and who establishes values and behavior of other people. So if you're not satisfied with the way the world is, how would you intervene? Would you try and change people's behavior? Would you try and have an impact on people's attitudes? What would make the world a better place? What would make us a more humane species, if you want to call that? That's kind of weird to think of the humans as being a humane species, but we're falling short on that definition in my mind. But it's a safe bet that by taking this course, one thing that will happen in the course of this semester is that your way of seeing the world will change. It absolutely has to change if you're going to think like a researcher. Probably because you're going to learn how to think critically instead of thinking passively. And let's get into what we mean by that. Critical thinking is reliant upon current knowledge. It sets aside personal opinion, very important. It sets aside your own belief system, also very important. And it looks at knowledge claims themselves. What defines knowledge? How are we going to determine knowledge? And that's what we are going to learn here in this semester. And we're going to start by learning why we think critically. The important thing about thinking critically is that we have to avoid inherent bias. By our very nature, we will be biased, but when we learn to think critically, we can learn to set aside our bias, and that's important. So I love this little cartoon that they put on page 12 in the textbook here. Not your scientific approach. Okay, so if you go to the theater, what are you going to go to? You're going to watch and choose entertainment that affirms your existing belief system. You're going to go down Easy Street. It's nice and easy to live on Easy Street, and nobody challenges you. You're going to go into a friendly bookstore featuring books that support your views. And so you're going to get psychic readings or total gibberish. Your choice. Believe what you want. And so how we define truth, how we define knowledge is very, very important. And that's part of a scientific approach. It's also part of critical thinking. Critical thinking is more than criticism, and it's a skill. It's more than just a skill or a tool. People think of critical skills. Well, critical skills is not the way of looking at critical thinking. Critical thinking, it's an active process. It's a dynamic engagement with information and ideas. It's your careful analysis based on current knowledge, which is the knowledge that we recognize today, not 100 years ago, not 200 years ago, not when the Catholic Church was established at the turn of the century or wherever you would determine Catholicism was birthed. We look at things based on current knowledge. What do we know now? Careful evaluation of how personal biases impact interpretation of knowledge. So, can you see the world through the lens of, if you're a Christian, can you see the world through the lens of an atheist? Can you see the world through the lens of a person who belongs to the Muslim faith? These are all important things as a researcher, because if you can't, there will be inherent bias in all of your work. Ethics and ethical codes, when we talk about research, come from, the book first deals with the Nuremberg Code, which came out of the Nazi war crimes trials. That dates to the 1930s. The Belmont Code, the Tuskegee syphilis study started in the 1930s or 40s, I believe, went all the way through into the 1970s. And the Belmont Code gave us respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. And so these are very important things when you learn about codes in this chapter. You need to understand codes. The Milgram experiment in 1963 was where they read about that in the textbook. Make sure you understand it. It's very important and it's very foundational. And it's about the experience that researchers had when they allowed people to think they were administering violent shocks to other individuals. The Zimbardo experience was also very telling because they allowed people to role play as a guard and a prisoner to find out how people would assume various positions when they had the authority of the guard and when they had to be submissive like a prisoner. And very, very unethical studies. The findings and the results, they had to stop these studies because what they found was it was really affecting the way people saw other human beings. So these ethics codes, there's very specific codes of ethical conduct depending on your field. We recognize the APA style when we cite our work. That's the American Psychiatric Association. But we follow fairly much at the Florida Atlantic University when we do our applications to get through the Institutional Review Board. We follow, and we have to actually take a course that studies the Belmont Report, which has to do with justice, beneficence, and respect for persons. So these ethical standards are very much a part of what we do, and you can't engage in the research process until you understand them. Specifically, in this course, we will be looking entirely at secondary data because, number one, we don't have the time. Number two, you don't have the experience as undergraduates to get through the Institutional Review Board process to make sure that all of your work, if you were going to do primary research, would actually pass the ethical codes that we have to make. So this is where we focus our effort at the Institutional Review Board, and especially in the College for Design and Social Inquiry, is on this Belmont report. That serves as the basis for the Federal Common Rule, and that's what we follow primarily. And this is on page 5, table 1.1. Informed consent is very important. I want you to understand that. It will be part and parcel of what we build on when you do your research project in this course. I want you to also understand the need and the requirements for debriefing. It's, like I said, we're not going to get into primary research, but you need to understand why this will be the requirement when you do this for an actual career. Is it okay to use deception? Very, very interesting reading in the textbook on that. I want you to pay close attention to it. Some ethics codes strictly forbid deception. There's very, very narrow circumstances where it would be allowed, and incredibly stringent requirements before it is allowed. Is it okay to give incentives for participation? Well, if the incentive is for participation, it should not be seen as coercive. There's very important ethical impact there, and also incentives should not be contingent on somebody completing the study. Confidentiality versus anonymity, very important distinction. Confidentiality must be maintained at all times. Anonymity is ideal, but it's not always possible. The scientific approach. We're going to spend a lot of time in the last part of this video on the scientific approach as a specific type of critical thinking. As we already, I showed you the cartoon of the theater where you go for affirmation of your existing belief systems, and the bookstore where you read friendly books. This scientific approach is very connected to that critical thinking process. And so what we're going to look at is why we use a scientific approach. we use it because it can help us make better decisions, both for individuals and broader policies, and the scientific approach helps us increase our knowledge base. So we start with critical thinking, asking ourselves what is current knowledge, not past knowledge, current knowledge. And then by doing this scientific approach to research, we expand our current knowledge. And we build on the work of others, and we rely upon the work of others, current work of others, it's in the here and now, and then we improve upon that, and we're always in this process of improving. That is the scientific approach. Step 1 through 7 here, it's very important that you understand these 7 steps. But I'm going to go through them a little more slowly. You'll read about them in the textbook. Do not cheat yourself by not reading everything in the books. These 7 steps are very important. I'm not going to go into them in the video, but you do need to make sure you understand why they're there in the textbook. So let's take the example that they use in the textbook of understanding students who plagiarize, intentionally or unintentionally. These students who do plagiarize, they risk, and they are understanding, they have a very clear understanding that they risk very severe consequences that could damage their college career. You could get booted out of college. Does knowing this make students less likely to plagiarize? So we're asking 2 questions now, and then we ask these questions such as these in the first step in the scientific approach. So let's take this part down by piece. One of the illustrations which they have in the book is this figure 1.4, and it talks about plagiarism, a bad idea. It essentially goes through these 3 points here with a diagram and a diagrammatic model. So these are the pages where you'll read about it, but where I want to go with this in the lecture is this idea that these steps that we looked at previously, steps 1 through 7, these steps were very, very important in looking at, and how we look at these 3 points here on this list here. Students who plagiarize intentionally and unintentionally. This is the equivalent of identifying your topic, step 1, and it's also assuming and presuming that you've already found, read, and evaluated past research of others. So this is your claim. This is how you open a research project. You start by finding the topic and making a claim based on what you know from common knowledge, the knowledge that other people have put out there as common to us in the current era of time. So that's point 1 and point 2. Step 1 is step 2. Step 3 is actually in 2 parts. The way we do the research project here in this course, we will develop a hypothesis, or plural, hypotheses, and then from that hypothesis or hypotheses, we will create meaningful research questions. So here we have 2 questions. So the hypotheses, that step of crafting, of creating a hypothesis, putting together your claim as a hypothesis, actually helps you craft these questions. Does knowing about plagiarism, then the serious consequences with plagiarism, does this make students less likely to plagiarize? That's a research question. There's a hypothesis associated with it and a null hypothesis, and that's what we're going to build on. But it's very important to also have this sentence that ends in a question mark. And we're going to learn why it's important that you actually ask the question in one sentence and end it with a question mark. So, does knowing this about plagiarism make students less likely to plagiarize? Another research question. It's valid to have 2 if they're related. What interventions might help improve students' knowledge and skills? Interventions to stop plagiarism. What interventions are there to decrease the incidence of plagiarism? What interventions might help improve students' knowledge and skills? So we thought we've kind of skipped a step here in the hypothesis and creating a hypothesis, but we've got these research questions. That's what I really wanted to focus on. This is a very, very important foundational beginning for the entire semester. The cycle of science, proof and progress in science, and this is how we build on knowledge. Your experiments and your research will build upon the research and experiments of others before you. And that's why peer-reviewed journals are critically important when we cite them. This research project that you will be doing in this semester will end with a research report, 8 to 10 pages long, that has to have at least 2 peer-reviewed journal sources. Without peer-reviewed journal sources, you have violated the scientific method. Because the cycle of science is that the research results are made public, others critique and verify the results, and if certain patterns are consistently found, researchers seek to ask more questions, more complex questions about the pattern, and then the cycle continues. That is the importance of scientific research. Figure 1.5, I'm not going to go into it here in the video, but I want you to make sure that you understand the context in which it is framed within the textbook. There's really important information on it which you can probably understand better by reading it in the textbook than having me lecture on it in a video. And one thing I want you to do to just test your reading for this chapter is the self-test. It's on page 22. The answers are on page 504. So practice 1.3, this is what the textbook makes available to you as students here. Identify different types of research design. So it asks 3 questions. Why would an experiment not be appropriate to investigate the relationship between ethnicity and health? What would be an appropriate research design? So why wouldn't we use an experiment? Why would we design some other kind of research? Question 2, the president of a university wants to understand how the beauty of the campus influenced the incoming class of students' decision to enroll in the university. What would be the most appropriate research design? So give some thought, think about what you know at this point in class. You're definitely going to have different ideas on this by the time you finish chapter 14, but at this point in chapter 1, this is an important exercise. You just have to do this on your own. This is not something you have to hand in. The answers are on page 504 as well. Point number 3, briefly outline a study to examine the impact of Facebook on mood. What would be the most appropriate research design? And these questions are going to be, if you haven't read yet, these questions aren't going to make a lot of sense. So make sure you read the textbook thoroughly, read the chapter 1 very, very thoroughly, and do your best to answer these questions. And if you haven't formulated the right kind of responses, send me an email and maybe share with me what your responses were and what you learned by checking the answers on page 504. Key terms that you're supposed to take from chapter 1, and it's very, very important. I grade the exams. All of the exams in this class are open book exams. And I grade the exams based on how much research vocabulary you use. So you should be keeping a list of key terms. This is on page 29 from the textbook if you want to write down your own glossary. If you have read the chapter and you don't understand these terms, causation, correlation, dependent variable, experimental design, independent variable, quasi-experimental design, testable hypotheses and variables, then you probably didn't read thoroughly enough. These are very, very key terms which we will be building upon. These are the foundation of what we are actually building through this coming semester. And a little bit of warning about being a 100% online class. This is the first time I actually haven't had classroom time for students to participate in. I haven't required attendance at classes before, but I've always had the classroom time available. So this is the first semester where there actually has not been classroom time reserved for us. This is a self-paced class. You can actually finish this earlier. You can read ahead if you want. I encourage you to read ahead. So if you've read the chapter before you watch the lecture videos, that's going to be a huge advantage in watching the video, because what you're going to learn from watching the video after you read is where I place the importance on your reading. And so if it's in a lecture video, you can guarantee it's going to be on a test. If it's not in a lecture video, you can just about guarantee it's not going to be on a test. So if you've read the book and got a broad understanding of what the chapter is about, and then you watch the video, you know what you need to retain as the most important information about the text, what you should have retained from your reading. So exams rely 100% on a thorough reading of the textbook, even if the topic is not covered in the lecture video. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of meat on the bones. Your research projects are going to rely upon your ability to formulate connecting, flowing paragraphs. These videos are highlights. They underscore key terms and key points. But your writing, which is an 8 to 10 page research project that is going to be due at the end of the semester, and your ability to give long answers in an open book test format for the midterm and the final exam, will only have that flow and connectivity that I require in them if you have a broad understanding of the textbook. So even though I don't cover key points from the textbook in these lecture videos, if you do not have that, if you haven't read it, then it's not going to be available for you to recall. And then you won't have that kind of flowing connectivity, which I really look for in long answer questions and in the research project. So for a review, the videos are probably good, but for a foundation, reading the entire chapter carefully and thoroughly is going to be essential. That's it for this module. I will tell you a little bit more about where the course goes and the syllabus in Module 2. And feel free, like I mentioned, to read ahead. Thank you for your time.